Monday, 13th May, 2013, just after 6 a.m. A refrigerated container rolled off a vessel at Tilbury Docks, mist rising from the metal as officers moved in for what should have been a routine inspection. Nothing about that moment suggested it would trigger nearly a decade of investigations, arrests, disappearances, or the collapse of two very different criminal networks, and a betrayal within the department the police never saw coming. Years later, Wednesday, 4th of August, 2021, shortly before 8 p.m., an unmarked team in West Yorkshire tailed a car making what looked like an ordinary evening run. Inside were parcels that would open the door to a separate chain of movements and a supply line stretching far beyond the county's borders. Two stories, one beginning with a frozen shipment that didn't add up, the other with a delivery that should never have been noticed. This is the story of how both networks were built, how they operated in plain sight, and how detectives, working steadily in the background, dismantled them piece by piece. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. The first case story starts with the morning run at Tilbury Docks. Containers offloaded, paperwork checked, temperatures recorded. Nothing unusual about a 12-ton consignment of frozen beef arriving from South America in May 2013. The unit was cold, solid, and stamped for delivery to a storage facility in Wigan. But when officers lifted the first crate, what they found inside stopped the process almost instantly. Hidden among the meat were holdalls packed with compressed blocks, hundreds of them, each marked with a distinctive emblem. By the time the count was complete, the weight came to more than 400 kilos of high-purity cocaine. The discovery was significant, but what followed was an even more tactical or deliberate move. Border Force removed every block, replacing them with dummy packages filled with house bricks, identical in weight and wrapping. The shipment was then resealed and allowed to continue its journey. It was a controlled move, designed to see who arrived to collect what they believed was still inside. Once the container reached Wigan, the criminal network behind it unraveled faster than anyone expected. When the holdalls were opened and the contents revealed, panic spread immediately. The group assumed they had been robbed by rivals. They had already paid out large sums, relied on trusted contacts, and believed the route was secure. But none of them imagined the product had been intercepted long before they even touched it. In the middle of that confusion, one name rose quickly to the surface: Anthony Saunderson. Trusted by senior figures, he was brought in to help recover the missing consignment. A recovery mission launched on the belief that someone, somewhere, had stolen nearly £20 million worth of cocaine. But the NCA was already watching, already listening, and already building a picture of his role. For Saunderson, the mission began with meetings held far from the docks. Surveillance teams later captured Stanton, McDermott, Saunderson and others gathering at Aintree Retail Park. Their conversations centered on tracing whoever they thought had taken the cocaine. Officers monitoring the group noted how quickly the tone shifted, from confusion to suspicion to talk of retaliation. As arrests began to close in on the main conspirators, the network splintered. Mossman was detained after abandoning the holdalls in Wigan. Keating and Oakford followed soon after. Anthony Short, the man who arranged the bogus import company, was caught and charged. Stanton fled the country but was tracked to Rotterdam and arrested under a European warrant. But one figure stayed out of reach: Saunderson. The more the group collapsed around him, the deeper he disappeared. For close to a year, he moved between addresses, relying on contacts tied to the same conspiracy to keep him hidden. The NCA listed him publicly as wanted for questioning, a fugitive linked to a plot edging towards violence. For close to a year, he stayed out of reach, moving between addresses and relying on criminal contacts for cover. Then, in May 2014, officers closed in on a flat at Salford Quays. Inside, they found Saunderson, along with cash and drugs that linked him back to the conspiracy. He was charged with drug supply, blackmail, and money laundering, and later handed a 10-year sentence, a term the Court of Appeal would eventually describe as lenient. What followed after his arrest wouldn't slow him down. It would move his story somewhere no one expected. What began as a blurred professional boundary inside HMP Kirkham shifted quickly once Saunderson reached the later stages of his sentence. The first visible sign emerged in the summer of 2018 when Governor Kerry Pegg arrived at work no longer in the modest Honda Jazz her colleagues were used to seeing. In its place was a £12,000 Mercedes C-Class, a car well beyond her means, later traced directly to 34 kilos of amphetamine supplied by Saunderson. The purchase marked the point where suspicion became harder to ignore. When anti-corruption teams eventually searched Pegg's flat, the scale of the entanglement was laid bare. Designer clothes and jewelry sat alongside everyday items that should not have been there at all. A toothbrush and a pair of Hugo Boss flip-flops, both carrying Saunderson's DNA. It painted a picture of a relationship that had crossed every boundary the prison system depends on, but the warning signs had been present long before the search. Pegg's financial situation was deteriorating, official records showing she once had just 6 pence to her name. Several county court judgments had gone undeclared. For investigators, that level of pressure made her vulnerability clear. Away from the prison, members of the criminal network had noticed the shift as well. EncroChat messages recovered years later showed associates frustrated that Saunderson was becoming distracted. He was maintaining contact with Pegg, distancing himself from his wife, and allowing what they described as personal issues to interfere with the business they expected him to lead. In those messages, he used the handles Jesse Pinkman and James Gandolfini, nicknames that suggested how he saw himself within the hierarchy, familiar, confident, and central to the operation he planned to return to once released. On paper, he left with structures in place meant to ease him back into ordinary life. Supervision, restrictions, and the continuing framework of the BADD program, which he was still delivering across several prisons. Within 2 months, investigators would later find he was already embedded in a new, far larger criminal operation. It began quietly, through old contacts in Liverpool and the wider Merseyside network, and expanded outwards to familiar routes in London, Spain, and Holland. These were connections he had relied on before his arrest in 2014, connections that had not weakened in his absence. The relationship with Kerry Pegg remained intact as well. By this time, she had moved into a wider regional post, overseeing drug strategy across 6 northwest prisons. The shift gave her more authority, more reach, and more influence. But it also maintained a direct line between them, one that Saunderson continued to exploit. EncroChat messages recovered later would show how frequently she appeared in the margins of his movements, present in conversations, even when not directly involved. By late 2019, his new allegiance was clear. He was aligning himself with the figures who would later become central to Operation Blue Sword, and we will talk about this in a few minutes. To those inside the conspiracy, Saunderson's return felt seamless, as though the years inside had simply sharpened his ability to organize. The next step was building the operation itself, and that began at Sealand. The operation's physical heart lay beyond Liverpool, tucked behind fields on the North Wales border at a property known as Wood Cottage in Sealand. What appeared from the outside to be a rural outbuilding was, in reality, an industrial-scale amphetamine factory. Throughout late 2019 and into 2020, vans arrived carrying barrels, boxes, and drums, materials that blended easily into the movements of legitimate trade, but the quantities were anything but ordinary. By the time investigators pieced the figures together, the group had handled around 2.6 tons of precursor chemicals, enough to produce roughly 900 litres of amphetamine oil and around 700 kilos of finished product. Inside the property, the setup was consistent with the Leuckart process, a method requiring heat, pressure, and controlled chemical reactions. Equipment lined the walls, reaction vessels, heating mantles, drums of solvent, protective gear. When EncroChat was eventually penetrated, officers recovered images taken from inside the cottage, photographs sent between members of the group to show progress, monitor quality, or request supplies. The scale was unmistakable. This was not small batch production, but an operation built to sustain regular distribution across multiple regions. Saunderson's role sat above the physical work. He acted as a coordinator and decision-maker, using encrypted EncroChat devices to manage orders, relay instructions, and monitor those working on the ground. As we have already covered about his handles, others communicated under names such as Nova Club, Paper Jaguar, Pierre White, Big Waiter, Striking Puma, Atom Game, Octo Ice, Park Plum, and Tactical Hawk, each one masking a real identity behind a layer of security the group believed was impenetrable. While amphetamine was the core focus of the Sealand site, the network did not limit itself to a single product. EncroChat logs showed transactions involving cocaine, heroin, ketamine, MCAT, cannabis, and diazepam, with distribution routes extending across England, Wales, and Scotland. But Sealand was only one half of the picture. While Sealand provided the means to produce the drugs, the network needed a second location to manage everything that came after. That role fell to a unit at Aintree Boxworks in Merseyside, an unassuming industrial space used as a hub for storing, pressing, packing, and dispatching the product moving out of Wood Cottage. Here, kilogram blocks were broken down, rebagged, sealed, and readied for delivery, with movements arranged through EncroChat in carefully timed runs. The unit sat close to major road links, giving the group a central point from which they could push orders across the UK with minimal delay. The supply routes stretched far beyond Merseyside. Communications recovered later showed deliveries reaching Glasgow, Dundee, Neath, Newcastle, and multiple towns across England. Runs were made using a mixture of rental vans, personal vehicles, and cars that had been professionally cleaned to remove traces of residue. On the other hand, drivers were instructed to stick to routine patterns, motorway stretches, service station stops, predictable timings, to avoid attracting attention. Cash flowed back in the same way. One journey carried £50,000, later seized from Garrett Kelly, whose presence at the unit linked him directly to its daily activity. At the organisational level, Paul Mount and Darren Owens emerged as senior lieutenants. Both played central roles in maintaining the production cycle at Sealand and overseeing distribution from Aintree. They handled orders, coordinated supply chains, and ensured that drugs and money moved constantly in both directions. Supporting them were figures such as Eccles and Pope, who were heavily involved in logistics and transport. Their vehicles, journeys, and recorded movements later helped investigators map the structure of the conspiracy with precision. Each played a role in sustaining the scale of the operation, ensuring that every stage, production, storage, transport, and payment, continued without interruption. As their system ran smoothly, there was one thing they never accounted for, something already moving towards their fall. As their encrypted messages kept the operation running, the very EncroChat system they relied on was already turning against them, pushing the whole empire toward its collapse. Messages sent from handles across the conspiracy began to appear on officers' screens. The content left little room for interpretation. There were recipes for chemical mixes, yield calculations, pricing discussions, and instructions about couriers, equipment, and storage. Images taken inside the Sealand Lab that we have already covered. For investigators, it was a level of access they had never previously achieved with encrypted networks. With this information, Operation Blue Sword was formally launched. Surveillance teams were deployed to match messages to real-life movements, linking the timing of each instruction to specific vehicles, routes, and meeting points. Phone mast data confirmed locations. The steady flow of cash and chemicals that had once seemed routine now formed a detailed map of the conspiracy's structure. By the end of 2020, the investigation had reached a point where the network could no longer move without encountering surveillance. Through late 2020 and into 2021, every major figure connected to the Sealand and Aintree operations was arrested. The evidence gathered was extensive. At Sealand, officers seized barrels of precursor chemicals, reaction vessels, heating equipment, and quantities of amphetamine at various stages of production. At Aintree, they found packed kilos, bagging tools, scales and traces, consistent with the large volumes of drugs passing through the unit. Cash was taken from vehicles, homes, and safe locations across Merseyside. The Crown outlined the scale with clarity. Drugs valued at more than £6 million, produced in a setting designed for continuous industrial output. The arrest phase also brought the internal misconduct case into full view. Kerry Pegg was charged with 2 counts of misconduct in public office and possession of criminal property, reflecting the Mercedes purchase and the personal relationship that had developed while she held a position of authority. Her case ran alongside the criminal conspiracy, but was inseparable from it. For Anthony Saunderson, the charges reflected his position within the hierarchy. He faced counts of conspiracy to produce and supply Class A and B drugs, conspiracy to possess firearms, and money laundering offences. As the cases moved into court, the structure of the network, once hidden behind encrypted screens, became a matter of public record. Sentencing would reveal exactly how the law responded to each of them. By the time the cases reached court in 2022, the structure of the operation was laid out in full. For Anthony Saunderson, the outcome reflected the role he played. In August 2022, he was sentenced to 35 years in prison, one of the most significant drug-related sentences handed down in the UK in the past decade. The misconduct case that intersected with his criminality came to its own conclusion shortly after. Kerry Pegg, once considered a rising figure in the prison service, was sentenced to 9 years. The wider network faced sentences that reflected the scale of the operation and the roles each man played. Paul Mount received 34 years. Darren Owens was jailed for 24 years. Kieran Hartley received 23 years for working closely with Owens at the Sealand Lab and assisting in the production of both Class A and Class B drugs. Michael Pope was handed 17 years and 6 months. Stephen Beebe was sentenced to 15 years and 6 months for his direct involvement in the amphetamine production line at the cottage. David Kelly received 15 years and 3 months. Stephen Sherwood was jailed for 14 years and 4 months for assisting with storage, movement, and logistics linked to drugs, chemicals, and cash. Lee Eccles received 8 years and 9 months for his part. In all, the group received more than 187 years of prison time. But while this network was being dismantled piece by piece, another operation hundreds of miles away was beginning to stir, one that would take investigators into a very different kind of supply chain. Early 2021 brought the first indications of a developing supply chain. Officers in West Yorkshire began noticing the same vehicles travelling identical routes, and the same individuals appearing across Wakefield, Huddersfield, Liverpool and Stockton with unusual regularity. Programme Precision pulled the intelligence together, revealing kilo quantities of cocaine and heroin moving quietly through the region. Meetings were brief, cash changed hands quickly, and nothing about the exchanges resembled street-level dealing. By August 2021, the operation that began with scattered observations had grown into a coordinated surveillance effort. Officers had spent months watching vehicles, mapping routines and matching movements across towns that rarely shared the same criminal footprint. The turning point came on the 4th of August 2021, when the monitoring teams noticed a sequence of journeys that broke from the group's usual patterns, tighter timings, faster handovers, and an urgency that suggested something larger was in motion. That evening, unmarked units followed a vehicle travelling along familiar West Yorkshire routes. Nothing about it stood out at first glance, but its stops aligned with intelligence gathered across the previous weeks, and when officers intervened, the scale of what they were dealing with became unmistakable. Hidden inside were multiple sealed packages of high-purity cocaine, methodically wrapped for wholesale distribution. The recovery totaled 26 kilos. a haul worth more than £2 million on the streets. Alongside the drugs, officers found bags containing close to £175,000 in cash, stored in bundles that indicated recent movement through the supply chain. The money had been arranged in a way that mirrored other regional operations, counted, compressed, and ready to be moved elsewhere in the network. Each package, each block of cocaine, and each bundle of notes formed part of a picture that had been building quietly in the background. The arrests that followed were calm and controlled. Some individuals offered little resistance. Others acted as though the entire situation was a misunderstanding. For the investigation, this was more than a seizure. It was confirmation, evidence that the activity linked to Liverpool and London was not speculation, but an established supply network operating at kilo-level scale. And with the first major haul secured, detectives knew the next phase would expose the structure behind it. Following the August seizures, investigators turned their attention to the movements that had taken place long before officers intervened. Over the next 4 months, a clearer structure emerged, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through the steady accumulation of travel data, phone activity, and financial patterns. When those strands were aligned, they revealed a supply line capable of moving up to 303 kilos of Class A drugs across England between August and December 2021. What began as scattered movements on motorways gradually narrowed to a defined group of individuals, each playing a different part in the system. Within Wakefield, Naveed Asghar handled both drugs and cash, acting as a key contact for consignments moving through the area. His role involved coordinating pickups, arranging handovers, and ensuring money flowed back through the chain with minimal disruption. In Huddersfield, Mohammed Adil Jamil played a central part in the onward movement of cocaine, managing local redistribution and maintaining contact with couriers responsible for getting stock into the surrounding towns. Alongside him, Nasir Hayat contributed to the Huddersfield arm of the operation, supporting routine handovers and acting as a point of contact for movements feeding into the local market. Further north, Alex Holder managed runs linked to Stockton-on-Tees, helping move consignments between the northeast and West Yorkshire. His role ensured regular deliveries passed through without breaking the pattern the network relied on. To the south, Mohammed Saeed operated out of Bournemouth, forming part of the southern line of the supply chain. His involvement linked West Yorkshire to regional distributors who relied on consistent supply rather than sporadic drops. In London, Olalekan Odedina acted within the Enfield branch of the network, helping maintain the capital's connection to the wider operation. His movements formed part of the upstream routes that fed product into towns hundreds of miles away. Every role fitted into a wider rhythm: couriers, organizers, handlers and coordinators moving in ways that, when viewed separately, appeared unremarkable, but when pieced together, formed a single operation running quietly on a national scale. By the end of the year, detectives could see the structure in full, a network whose movements were precise, deliberate, and far larger than first expected. The investigation that brought the network down was led by West Yorkshire Police's Programme Precision Team, a unit built specifically to target serious organised criminals and the violence that follows large-scale drug supply. Precision officers are stationed across the county, working cases that often overlap different towns, different offenders and different routes, and this conspiracy quickly became one of the most significant to pass through their hands that year. Once the early seizures confirmed the scale of what they were dealing with, the team continued to work the case through the fundamentals. As further drugs were traced back to the group, investigators were able to place the defendants within a wider system, a kilo-level chain supplying heroin and cocaine that would have been broken down and sold in smaller amounts on the streets of West Yorkshire and beyond. For the officers involved, the aim was simple. The drugs moved by the group represented the kind of supply that fuels the violence and exploitation seen in towns across the region, and stopping it meant cutting into a market that had been functioning quietly behind the scenes. As every piece of evidence came together, detectives were able to map the structure of the operation with confidence, linking the defendants to the supply routes they relied on. By the end of 2021, the case was complete, arrests were made, and the conspiracy was ready to be brought before the courts. Proceedings began in October 2021 at Leeds Crown Court, where the structure of the network was laid out in full, with the court hearing how the group worked in coordinated routes stretching from Liverpool and London into West Yorkshire. Across all hearings, the court emphasised the coordinated nature of the operation. Detective Inspector Kevin Daly described the group as a kilo-level supply chain, structured to move drugs efficiently into West Yorkshire's street markets. The first group to be sentenced were those who had entered guilty pleas. Naveed Asghar received 7 years and 3 months, reflecting his involvement in operations. Mohammed Adil Jamil was sentenced to 6 years and 9 months, supported by financial evidence and device analysis. Stephen Conroy was handed 5 years and 6 months. The men convicted after trial followed at the same hearings. Nasir Hayat received 4 years and 6 months for cocaine and criminal property offences. Alex Holder was jailed for 3 years and 9 months. The final defendants, Mohammed Saeed and Olalekan Odedina, returned to court on the 14th of November for sentencing. Saeed received 3 years and 9 months, whereas Odedina received 4 years and 6 months for his role. With the final sentences in place, the network had been dismantled. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK Crime Documentaries.